A court hearing was held today ahead of the trial for a former Oakland daycare provider charged with manslaughter in connection with an infant's death in 2023.
Lisa Barney of Oakland was arrested in September of 2024 after an investigation into the death of a 4-month-old infant in September of 23. Authorities say the baby suffered injuries during an incident about a week earlier, and an autopsy by the state medical examiner ruled the manner of death a homicide. Barney has pleaded not guilty.
Ahead of trial, attorneys and the judge met today to discuss what evidence and testimony will and won't be allowed. That included references to the child remaining alive for 8 days after the alleged incident, as well as certain photographs the defense described as gruesome. The judge ruled those items will be excluded for now, though that could change if prosecutors ask to revisit it.
The court also discussed Barney's history as a provider. The state said character witnesses may not be relevant, noting much of what would be described occurred with parents present, unlike the circumstances in this case. The defense said the testimony is intended to show Barney's routine practices and how she ran the daycare.
Realistically, what we have is a licensed and regulated profession and evidence that she has performed that profession in ways that have been within the boundaries of the rules and practices of that profession is certainly evidence, and it's more competence, not character.
One, I think those instances are not relevant. And two, these witnesses would testify to what they observed watching Miss Barney with their child for a very limited time. We're talking about a drop-off or a pickup. The issue is how Barney handled this child on this date when there were no adults present.
The judge ruled to allow character evidence, with that also subject to change. Attorneys are back in court Thursday for jury selection.